So, Setareh Sadeqi, thank you for taking the time out of your weekend to discuss these matters. It seems
Thank you for having me.
my impression over the last few months since the death in custody of Mahsa Amini is that we've kind of done another one of these cycles that happen every 2 years or 3 years, where we're told that the Islamic Republic of Iran is facing its greatest challenge in its existence, only for that unrest to basically peter out and not really go anywhere. So, how, being where you are, how do you describe the situation? Is it all over or is it continuing in certain areas?
It's almost over. I mean, the protests have almost died out. It's been a few weeks that, for example, nothing has been happening in my city or in major cities. Certain unrests and in a very smaller scale have been happening at certain areas, but we are not seeing major protests anywhere anymore. And not at universities, not on the streets, and that's for the majority of uh, the cities and towns. Um, and even on social media, the like famous, let's say, Telegram channels or Twitter accounts that were posting about the protests nonstop 24/7 have. I was actually taking a look at some statistics on their content over the past week or two, and how they have declined, and how the protests are not being discussed as much anymore, even with those uh, like social media accounts. So yeah, and as you said, like we have this going on media and social media and on mainstream media, that the Islamic Republic is almost going to collapse anytime, and it's having its last days. And this is that I have been hearing all through my life, um, having been born after the revolution and during the um Saddam's war on Iran. And well, I mean, there are serious challenges, but so far we're not seeing that happen.
And that's certainly not to say that like the cause of the unrest wasn't a genuine issue. One of the more surprising developments, just looking at it from an outside perspective, is that apparently the force that took Mahsa Amini into custody, the so-called guidance police or the guidance force, however they're officially
Patrol, yeah.
referred to, have apparently been disbanded. And it seems that the law on hijab is, it seems, not being actively enforced. Is that still the case?
Well, what I see on those streets and what I hear from people and from other cities, and is that we're not seeing the guidance patrol as such anymore, or at least not as much as before. I personally haven't seen any, but it's also important to remember that the guidance patrol did not exist in all the cities, like in the first place. And for example, in Esfahan or even in Tehran, there were certain places that you would expect them. And it wasn't that they were always, enforcing the hijab law everywhere, and you could expect them on any street. And even the methods of like enforcing the law was different, and that's something that was considered as discriminatory. Like, for example, in northern well-off areas of Tehran, where people are basically not wearing the hijab, you would never see or expect a guidance patrol, because like in that area it had become like very common, or the guidance patrol didn't feel they can enforce it. But in the other areas, you would have them. Sometimes it would be just telling people to correct their hijab, and sometimes it would get as violent as what we saw with Mahsa Amini, that she would be taken to the police station, where they apparently offer some, like a couple of hours of education on how you have to observe this law. So I think it's very important to know that it wasn't that the guidance patrol was already everywhere and it was very strict, but now with the protests and the things that have happened, and even officials and religious scholars talking about how this is so wrong to forcefully want to enforce this law, it has become very difficult for the government to enforce the hijab law like they did before. And that's one reason you don't see the guidance patrol everywhere.
It's very interesting to hear that what you call like religious authorities actually criticizing the idea of enforcing it. Like that, to many outsiders, would sound very counterintuitive. Like who? Like I don't know how specific you can get, but
Yeah. Well, discourse on abolishing the guidance patrol has been there for a long time, for many years, and the forces to enforce the hijab law were there, but with different forms and different names. And this one started, I think, if I'm not mistaken, around maybe 2000, 4 or 5, something around there then, with the current name that we have. And as I said, like during the times the names changed, or sometimes the how strict they were would change depending on the situation and the society and everything. So this discourse was there. It was even discussed on the national or the state TV and on universities and scholarly gatherings and everything. But we have different types of religious scholars, and I mean different types of discussion going on with religious scholars. Some are saying that the hijab should not be obligatory in the first place. Some are saying that, well, it should be, but the methods of the law enforcement have to be changed, and it should just be like telling people, not arresting them or anything. And this is, I would say, the majority of the discussion. I mean, the bigger discussion that we're seeing among the officials, that the hijab law should stay in place because the majority of the people want it. I mean, that's what their impression is. And but we have to change the methods, and it's very wrong the way we have been enforcing it, and it has been counterproductive. And this has been even mentioned by senior clergy within the sections of the government who had responsibilities with enforcing the law, or they were related to that section of the government. And I haven't seen anyone or any official defending what the guidance patrol has been doing. So like right now, especially after the protests and everything, you're seeing everyone, almost everyone, critical of the way it has been enforced. And the government has also said that they are going to review not only the guidance patrol, but even the mandatory hijab law. But they have also implied that they don't think it's going to change. I mean, the mandatory hijab law is not going to change, but it is a possibility at this point that the guidance patrol would be totally abolished. But it's not very clear that it's going to be achieved or when it's going to be achieved.
it sounds like, because my next question was going to be like, do you get the sense that the enforcement will simply come back but in a different form, or does this seem to be more of a permanent change? And with the two sides seemingly like very forcefully disagreeing with each other, is the most likely middle ground, do you think, that the law will remain as it is, but it simply won't be really enforced in any way? Because as you say, it seems to only be a minority of women that don't observe it if it isn't being actively enforced.
Yeah, that's the I mean, I think the government is also considering the I mean, a great proportion of the population who think that the hijab law has to stay in place and has to be enforced. So, I mean, I think it's very difficult to know because we have been going through tension, and the rhetoric that comes from the government has been mostly to, I mean, avoid more tension, but at the same time, we have heard statements that were not really helpful and could trigger more tension inside the country. For example, we also had clergies that were saying that hijab is not being enforced well enough, and that this is an attack on families and everything. So we are hearing a mix of statements and comments on that. What I believe is going to probably happen is that, yes, the government is going to relax a little bit, and we're probably not going to see the same form of enforcement of the law. But I do not think we're going to see a total abolishment of the law enforcement anytime soon.
How, if at all, do you think that this is, because obviously this is not the only socially charged predominantly cultural religious issue. Like, what other similar laws do you think might also be either enforced in a much more relaxed way, or perhaps not enforced? Like, I mean, the most obvious examples that come to mind are like public alcohol consumption or cohabitation or something. Is there much of a not enforce laws as much?
Well, I think like on the consumption of alcohol, I'm sure that this is not going to happen at any time within the, I don't know, like how long, I would say. And there is, I mean, obviously there is a black market of alcohol, and it's not that either it's not happening in Iran, but the still a majority of the Iranian population considers that not, I mean, they don't, because we have a Muslim population that even the ones that are not like strictly practicing, alcohol has not been viewed positively, and it's not like there's not a public demand. Whereas with hijab, because it is very it highly depends on where you come from. Like in one city, it can be very relaxed. In another city or culture, it can be more strict. So that's where these disagreements come from. Like there are some cities where you probably would have a very difficult time finding a few women who are observing the hijab in a very relaxed way, but in other cities it's very difficult to see people who are actually observing it very strict. And it's not because they're not, for example, I mean, all of it is not related to how well practicing Muslims these people are, but how their culture, their local culture, has defined hijab and modesty for them. But when it comes to alcohol, that's not really the case. And neither the scholars and clergy and nor the public have disagreements on whether this is a part of the religion or not. Because for hijab, there are arguments that it's very cultural dependent. But when it comes to alcohol, that's not the case. And I don't think that's going to happen. And I don't think the Iranian public is really, I mean, the majority of the Iranian public does not want that. As for cohabitation, it's been happening. Like there's not a law that prohibits it because people can just go and rent places or buy places and nobody asks them, unless the owner himself or herself is sensitive about that or wants to have certain rules for themselves. But it's not like that there is a governmental law that prohibits that from happening. So whether we're going to see more of it or not depends on how people want to pursue that and how the culture or the Iranian public would move towards that. So yeah, I mean, these two are, I don't think we're going to see a big change in that.
But it sounds like that perhaps wherever the needle sort of ends up pointing, from what you're saying, it sounds like it'll be primarily determined by the specific area that you're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's very, and I mean, it's interesting to also know that um, a lot of people who have been reporting being scolded for example, their as they call improper dresses or hijab, have been reporting that people, like ordinary people on the streets, are telling them, look, and it's, again, this is something that has to do with the local culture, like. Uh, for example, in my city, it is something that you might see happening, that you're on the bus or on the streets and random religious people come to you and ask you to observe your hijab in a like a better way. So because they think that's the way to like preserve their culture and they see it as an attack on their family. So yeah, I think the local culture, and I mean, at the end of the day, with all the difficulties and challenges that exist, it's the people who are going to shape what is going to come out from the governments.
So it sounds basically like the government is more or less following the lead of the society.
Yeah, you mean in the case of hijab?
Yeah, well, I mean, like in general, would you say that that's the case?
That the government is not following.
I know that
Can you get, yeah?
the government like basically seems to take its cues from the society at large about
Yeah,
how
that's true.
little it will enforce these laws.
Yeah, that's true because I mean, even if they like they try not to do that, and not if even if they try to ignore the public demands, at some point it becomes very difficult because the public is not going to allow that to happen. And if you see it's happening in, I mean, in most cases, but not all cases, it's that that the majority of the population are not really against it. So if it were, I mean, if they were, it would be very, very difficult to impose that law. But sometimes this happens over a very long process because the government shows more, I would say, like, I don't know, like they would resist it more strongly to give in to the public demand. And sometimes it's because, uh, um, like, the public is not, uh, I mean, does not agree on a certain issue, and there are disagreements, like based on their culture or the city or I mean, the city that they come from, that it becomes difficult to see major consensus among the public on a certain issue.
Well, I mean, I can only really speak for myself, but it seems that a lot of the external discourse, whenever this kind of unrest occurs, like a lot of these voices, when discussing the issue of the hijab, seem to believe that it is absolutely foundational to that it being legally enforced is absolutely foundational to the legitimacy of the Islamic Republic, so that if it's suddenly effectively not being enforced, that would seem to herald that it's like its collapse is imminent. But it seems that probably would not be the case.
Well, yes, that's also part of the discussions that we hear inside the country. There are people among the conservatives that view it as some sort of a red line, that the abolishment of which would like jeopardize the Islamic values or the values of the Islamic Revolution. But they are also reminded by other people or forces or sections of the population inside the country that the hijab law was not enforced immediately after the revolution, and it took it a few years until it became the law. So it wasn't an integral part of the Islamic Revolution in the beginning, but I mean, it became part of the law, as I said, later on. So it does not. I mean, that's how they're reminded that it does not necessarily mean that you are abandoning a certain like very important value of the Islamic Revolution. But when there are forces from outside the country, especially from the US or UK or certain European countries that have a record of hostile reactions toward Iran, including imposing sanctions, supporting and arming Saddam against Iran, or supporting terrorist groups and funding them inside and around Iran, then it becomes very difficult because it looks like it's a demand by the West rather than by the people inside Iran. So the government takes a stronger stance towards it because they think they are giving in to, I mean, it becomes easy for them to say that that's a demand that is coming from outside and not really inside. So it makes it very difficult for the struggle inside Iran um, to pursue certain laws or certain changes to the law, like the ones regarding hijab, because it's very, very easy. And I mean that's what you see, that um, when it comes to the hijab law, there are a lot more coverage and so-called support coming from the West and outside. For example, this is an example that I've been giving to people, especially those in the West, that look at the 2019 protests, and they were massive, and a lot of people were killed during the protests. But the protests were over the fuel prices, and you did not get as much coverage of those protests because, I mean, it's a common thing around the world that people pour to the streets to demand more economic ease or protest certain economic decisions. But when it comes to the hijab law, it's very easy to otherize the Iranian nation and the Iranian government. And even if it's not as big, they would want to, you know, use some sort of a hyperbolic rhetoric to show those protests. And because, as I said, it's a very effective tool to otherize the Iranian nation and to demonize the Iranian government to do so.
Do you think that it might actually work to the political system's advantage? Because, as you point out, these sources of cultural, social tension so often cynically exploited from the outside for political purposes, that if they were to take if the government or the political system were to take a more conciliatory approach, that would really diffuse a lot of the effectiveness of these tactics originating from outside the country.
Well, in the short run, it might become easier for the government to not to take any decision that would be considered controversial by the public or I don't know, like in the world even. But in the long run, it becomes very difficult for the government to decide whether to give in to the public demand and satisfy public opinion uh, while not looking as weak or having given into a demand that comes from outside. So yes, I think in the short run, it makes it easier for the governments to just not want to abolish that law because they can just show people with evidence how this is coming from outside. But in the long run, people are not going to give in. Like the Iranian society is very dynamic and very active, and I don't think the government can totally just ignore the public demand on that. And in the long run, it becomes very difficult to how to compromise and how to like keep both sides, like not to appear weak, but at the same time meets public demand.
This is a very expansive question, so you may or may not have a perspective on it. But I mean, to take the example of European countries like Britain, France, and Germany that always tend to contribute their own, well, input into these kinds of periods of political unrest. I mean, this is dipping into a very different topic, but given the quite rapid geopolitical decline, there's really not much other way to say it, of, for example, Europe and its capacity to really interfere at all. Surely that would, on some level, make the campaigns for certain issues in Iran more easy or easier, because it would be much more clearly a source, like a discourse only happening from within the society rather than having these nefarious foreign powers trying to manipulate certain people into supporting regime change. Does that Make sense?
Well, yeah, I think I understand your question, and I think if that was the case, I mean, if these farm hires would just stick to their own problems and start dealing with them, like all the things that are happening, as you said and mentioned, in Europe, it would become much easier for the struggle inside Iran for more like equal rights or women's right, because then there's, I mean, it's just something between the Iranian nation and their government, and it becomes a lot easier to pursue that demand because, I think it's also very important to remember that over these years, we have a few thousands of NGOs working actively with women's rights inside Iran, and they have been influencing the political decision making system, and like Iranian women have been able to change certain laws to make them better for themselves. It's a long process, but that's how things happen here. Like you elect different members of the parliament, you educate the public, and that's how it works. But what I am seeing is that just look at the case of, for example, Germany or Europe in general with regards to Ukraine. Uh, the policies that these countries are making are hurting their own people, but they don't want to stop obeying the US, or they don't want to stop doing something that is beneficial to their own population. So I think actually when powers and countries get to that point where they feel like there's almost nothing to lose, it's more dangerous, and they take, like Germany has been um, involved in these like riots inside Iran at an unprecedented level. And it's amazing how they have been supporting like and rebranding some certain terrorist groups like the MEK even. So I mean, maybe in the long run they will gradually back off and deal with their own problems of energy crisis and I don't know like certain terrorist group inside Europe, like especially the ones with Nazi ideologies coming up. If they start dealing with their own problems, they would be doing their own nations and the Iranian nation good because it makes the struggle inside Iran a lot easier. But unfortunately, up to this point, that does not seem to be the case. Like even the European nation, like the people inside Europe, are suffering from these policies and the decision making of their political system. But it does not seem that they want to give up. And I mean, it's coming from Iran, which has been paying a price for standing to the US. It's amazing for me how, for example, Germany, with a very strong economy, does not want to stand to the US and does not want to save its own people and its own economy. So I'm not surprised if they continue to take measures that hurt the Iranian nation because they don't care about their own people. So why should they care about the Iranian nation? And let's not forget that the Iranian nation have a very bitter memory of how Germany armed Saddam with chemical weapons, and the effects of it is still there. So yeah.
Well, to bring it back to the sectors of the political and societal elite you mentioned, for whom the idea of enforcing the hijab is really a red line. It sounds from what you're saying like that is a minority position. Would that be correct?
Yes, that's my perception.
Mm.
But it's also that these are right now the current government is more inclined to that position. So I mean, there are officials who are stating otherwise, but among the current parliament members and certain officials, that's something that it's not very that's a position that is not very difficult to find.
So these changes that are apparently happening probably won't be that politically damaging to the current government. In other words, the current president.
You mean these conservative viewpoints on hijab?
Yeah, like they won't be like President Raisi, in other words, probably won't suffer politically because a relatively more lenient standard is being enforced?
No, like actually it would benefit the current government, especially with the economic difficulties that we're saying, and it's becoming very I mean, it's been deteriorating over the past few months. That's actually some sort of a leverage that the government can use in order to sort of satisfy public opinion, to just show more ease on like social issues or on the issue of hijab.
Well, in that vein, I remember reading something somewhere, I cannot remember exactly where, but that there was a parliamentary committee that was set up to basically investigate instances where people, during the recent unrest, where people's rights were violated. I don't know how closely you followed that, but had they made any findings?
Well, it's an ongoing process, and I'm not sure when we're going to hear a final word on that, but yes, and that's also, I mean, the parliament has also been, as I said, considering like viewpoints by different scholars and NGOs and things, and like taking into consideration all these things along with those opinions coming from non-governmental organizations and entities, to see that's also going to, as they say, to have an effect on the way they will review the hijab law and the enforcement of the law. So, well, I hope something comes out of it, but we're still waiting. We're seeing cases, for example, like where a couple of police officers have been arrested or dismissed because of the way they handled the protest in certain areas. But that's not necessarily a part of the same committee. So the committee has a broader mission, and it's still going on.
Well, you mentioned briefly like the level of foreign involvement in exacerbating the unrest. Would it be correct to say, well, I mean, based on our conversation, it basically sounds like you would agree that this has been an genuine internal issue, but one that has been intentionally amplified, or the violent aspect of it has been amplified from outside the country. Would that be correct?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's true.
And how
The
would you say
protests were legitimate.
like, what are the mechanisms that you're aware of that this external interference is, how has it been carried out?
Well, as you also said, that the legitimate protest that started in September 2022, like they immediately turned into violent riots, and we saw an unprecedented number of police officers and security forces killed, which like normal protesters would not do. But the evidence that this has been supported from outside is, I mean, it's not the first time that these protests from inside are being hijacked and amplified and exploited, but it is an unprecedented level when you see that, for example, like fact checking becomes like absolutely unimportant, even with government officials like, for example, Justin Trudeau, or even the special rapporteur on the status of human rights in Iran, Javed Rahman, the UN's rapporteur. He does not bother to do a simple fact check when making statements on Iran. And he, for example, mentioned that Kurdish names like the name like Mahsa's Kurdish name, which is Shina, are forbidden in Iran. But a quick search on the registry website of Iran shows that more than 5,000 people in Iran are actually named Shina, and Kurdish names are not forbidden. So the UN Special Rapporteur makes a statement on Iran to trigger certain ethnicity and women to say that their rights are being violated without doing a basic fact check. Or in the case of Justin Trudeau, he tweeted something, I don't know where, on which Twitter account or I don't know where he actually got that information, like lie, that 15,000 protesters are going to be executed in Iran. This is like, you can say anything about Iran without doing the simple fact check. He had to remove that tweet later on, but like it was retweeted and went viral, and the impact that it can have on the image that you're making of Iran is still there. I mean, even if you remove that tweet, it goes on, and these accounts are not, they don't receive a warning or anything. For example, J.K. Rowling retweeted a video where an Azerbaijani drama scene was happening, and it's very funny that it had been going viral on different topics for over the years, like in Syria, Corona, and everything. And this time they were saying that this is an Iranian Kurdish father grieving the death of her daughter who just died in the protest. And J.K. Rowling has like about 14 million followers, and she retweeted that video without even checking if that was true. And later people were reminding her that this is a drama scene from an Azerbaijani TV series, and she didn't mind having it on her page. And you see, for example, Jordan Peterson, who is supposed to be a psychologist, retweeting and following Mariam Rajavi, who is the head of this notorious terrorist cult. And these people don't even do a simple check to see where the origins of these statements on Iran are coming from. We have seen a number of examples where the pictures of like singers and rappers were posted as someone who died in the protest, and they were retweeted by these celebrities. And John Bolton confessed, I mean, he admitted on an interview with BBC, if I'm not mistaken, BBC Persian. He said that this time we have been able to deliver arms to the protesters, either by from the borders with this separatist groups, terrorist groups, or, well, of course he doesn't call them terrorist groups, but they are basically terrorist groups who have killed many Iranians, Iraqis, Syrians, Turkish people, and or by like sending people to attack police officers and security forces and police stations and confiscating or like getting arms from them. So I mean, they're not even hiding that. They're saying it, well, and he has been taking pride in organizing and designing coups in various nations, and he's now saying that they have been able to get arms into the hand of these peaceful protesters who have killed about 70 police officers and security forces so far. So I mean, it's crazy how these so-called supports are coming for the protesters, and that when things get to that, a lot of the peaceful protesters actually withdraw because they don't want to lose their life by random shooters or like knife or stabbers on the streets. They have a legitimate concern and they came for that, but when they see that these protests go violent, they can't continue their cause, and they had to withdraw. And that's where we saw more violent forms of riots going on. So like also talking about Twitter and social media, we have also seen an unprecedented level of or number of hashtags. In fact, hashtags regarding Mahsa Amini broke a historical record on Twitter, surpassing 300 million, which I don't know how this has been the most pressing issue of the world in, like, let's say 10 years or something. Like, not even the Ukrainian war, not even Black Lives Matter, but this one. And troll farms and bots are very active, obviously, because Iranians were having a lot of problems connecting to the internet in the first place. And Twitter is not a very popular social media in Iran, unlike, for example, Instagram. So I mean, it's very evident how we're seeing a very exaggerated coverage of the protests, and how even terrorist groups are being supported to interfere in this protest and turn them into violent riots, where more people get killed, and the nation gets angry, and then you have a chaos very similar to what happened in Syria, for instance.
Is the level of disconnect, you think, between the international supporters of the protests and the apparent reality, is it because basically the indigenous community of NGOs that you referred to before and the UN and presumably Amnesty just don't talk to each other? Is that the reason?
Well, I think the main reason is that there is a political agenda that they have to forward, and it does not matter if it matches with the facts on the ground or not. When you see, for example, that Saudi Arabia is still on the UN Women Commission, or even the US itself is on the UN Commission of Women, but Iran is being removed, which was only recently elected by a majority of the voters in the UN Commission. And when, as I said, you see that the special rapporteur on the status of human rights does not care about fact checking when making a statement on Iran, it shows that it's beyond just not being connected. I'm sure they're going to make this excuse that Iran does not allow, for example, the fact-finding commission, or does not allow the special rapporteur on Iran. But well, I think Iran has every right. I mean, legally, it's not abiding, and Iran does not have a responsibility to allow the fact-finding mission or any other UN mission. But even if it was a legal procedure, when you see that there is a very politicized, like heavily politicized decision by the UN, who is considered to be an impartial body to facilitate relations between the countries, it becomes a tool at the hands of the US imperialist power to just subjugate and to do more. And what happens at the end of the day is that there are more sanctions imposed on Iran, and who are the sanctions hurting except ordinary people? I mean, the government, um, um, it does not affect the government as much as it affects the ordinary people. It cripples the sanctions, and the government will always find its way to evade the sanctions, but it is the people, especially women and children, who are being hurt by these illegal sanctions. And the UN does not care. So it's very difficult to believe that there is a genuine will and determination inside those international, so-called international bodies, to find the truth about Iran and to make it easier for Iranian women to achieve their goals.
Do you think for that reason that indigenous or internal NGOs, women-led NGOs in particular, need to be more forceful in the international discourse? Or obviously that can only get you so far if, as you say, there is a predetermined agenda, various institutions. But is that something that you think would improve the level of discourse?
Well, I think the NGOs, the Iranian NGOs, have learned over the years that they should just stop caring about what the UN or other international bodies are saying, and just do their work with all the difficulties that they might have inside Iran. So to pursue with changes of the law, or empowering women, creating more job opportunities, eradicating poverty, and supporting women who are like single mothers, or women who are supporting their families. But I mean, Iranian NGOs have also been trying to work hard with like UNESCO or UN, and the sanctions make it very difficult because there is no support no support can come from outside, and the economy is struggling inside, so it becomes very difficult to find sources, and they are non-governmental organizations, and so it kind of makes their struggle double or multiple times more difficult. But I mean, they're still trying to, like, some of these NGOs have consultative status with the UN, and they work with the UN. They have they send reports, they send representatives to UN like meetings, so that they speak on behalf of Iranian people. Although it does not always happen, and because of various reasons, including that only a certain number of NGOs get to speak at the UN.
Some
But
examples of
yeah,
the
I mean,
NGOs and the issues that they campaign on.
well, for example, like I can tell you about one that I have that I sometimes volunteer with, and they have a consultative status. It's called the International um, um, Justice Watch Association, and their primary goal is to eradicate poverty and bring about social justice for people, especially those coming from underprivileged areas or inside in Tehran and in other cities, especially in rural areas where there are more difficulties. Uh, but it's run mostly by women. Like most of the members of this NGO are women. I actually know maybe two men working with it, and like the majority of us are women, and they're all highly educated and working with these governments. And some of the issues that they have is like providing, as I said, empowering women, single mothers or women who are supporting their families financially, and they raise money for them, and they work with like they push for more equal opportunities for women in jobs, and these are some of the things that they have been doing. Even though like this particular NGO that I work with is not it's not like specialized on working with women, but it is an important part of it. And the heads of the international relations is a woman, the instructors are women, and the majority of the volunteers are women, and they work with women, as I said, and they try to support them.
Well, given we would probably agree, disproportionate level of importance given to the issue of hijab being enforced in public, what are the real leading issues in regards to gender equality in Iran that you see?
Well, I think Iranian women want, or I can speak on my behalf only, but I think I would like to see more job opportunities. Like we don't have a very um, I mean, gender gap is not that much of an issue that equal opportunity is. For example, university professors are paid equally. Like there is not a difference between men and women. The difference is in what major you studied or what university you teach, but not based on gender. But I would like to see more women in the political decision-making system. I would like to see more women in any just job opportunities. And with regards to like family laws, I would like to see more support for women's rights in marriage, like the law regarding divorce, or supporting or the like the custody of the children. It has changed, it has improved a lot over the years, but I would like to see even more improvement and more equal rights for women, because women, like more than 50% of university students in Iran are women, so they deserve to be given a higher percentage of involvement in the society, and in their personal life, and about also in the job market.
Well, I can
Yeah.
imagine the way that someone with a certain agenda might spin that answer as saying, oh, she wants to lessen the importance or the prominence of Islamic law or whatever in relation to these issues. But I'm guessing that that is probably not the stance that you and your colleagues probably come at it from, that you don't see it as sort of making a less Islamic family law system, for
Of
example.
course. Yeah, that's a very good point. Like I come from a religious background, and I'm a practicing Muslim, and I highly regard Islamic values. But the thing is, certain laws have not been directly driven from the Quran or the religious text, and according to Islam, they can be highly dependent on the cultural setting and of the society. So the laws can change, and Islam allows for that. And as I said, over the years, we have been changing the law to improve the opportunities for women. And that has happened by religious Muslim women. It's not that they were referring to some Western source or some, I don't know, like outside sources to improve that. And we have a lot of we have so many examples in that in Islam. As someone who strongly believes in Islam, I would refer to a lot of examples like where the Prophet of Islam encouraged women's involvement in the society. Like even more than 1,000 years ago, there were books on women's sermons and the sermons that these women gave in public gatherings, and how they were uh, an important part of the Islamic development, the Islamic movement. I mean, without them, it would be impossible. And that's how we think. That's another point that we have to consider when studying Iran. That still the majority of Iranians consider Islam as the source of their values, and even women who want more equal opportunities or more rights refer to Islam to say that this law has to be changed. And there's I mean, the Islamic law and jurisprudence is also very dynamic, and it allows for considering cultural settings and the requirements of the time. I would refer to like one example. It's not necessarily about women's right, but one example is when Imam Khomeini allowed for gender reassignment surgery. Like he issued a fatwa to allow for that, and this was not something that was discussed in the earlier years of Islam. But when he talked to doctors and specialists, and he realized that this is something that could be necessary for some people, he issued a fatwa to allow for that. So, I mean, I want to remind the audience that how it can be flexible, and how certain laws that like you would not ever think it could be allowed in Islam can actually be allowed. And it doesn't mean that we're compromising our Islamic values.
So, what do you think, if you could limit it to a few sentences, would you want to say to people, particularly in the West, who do spend quite a bit of time thinking about the condition of women in countries such as Iran, which is one of the main examples that usually come to mind? If someone is concerned about the status of women, like what would you say that they should or shouldn't do?
Well, I think the most important issue is to listen to women inside Iran. Remember that the Iranian society is not a monolithic society, just like any other society. There are different opinions. And if we believe in democracy, we need to consider all opinions and respect all opinions, even if we don't agree with. And I think it's also very important to understand that women in different parts of the world have different notions of freedom and improvement and progress. So if one nation's notion of progress and freedom is different from us, it does not mean one of us is superior to the other. It's just a difference of culture. And I think it's very important to respect these cultural diversities. And I mean, that's the beauty of the world, where if everyone thought the same way, it would be a very, very boring world. And I think it's very important to understand that like we're equal human beings with different ideas on certain issues. I'm sure if more people traveled to Iran and saw clothes by like on their own, how Iranian women are very active in the society, and they are taking the lead in many different issues. How there are we have women active in different parts of the knowledge production. In like we have doctors, we have pilots, we have university professors, we have business women. and they're all very active, and they would, I'm sure it would surprise a lot of people around the world. And they should also understand that for a lot of people, this scarf that's is probably not very different from some sort of a hat that people wear. And it's not it's something that they believe in. It's not that some men imposed it on them and they feel like oppressed.
Well, yeah, it's been extremely interesting to hear from someone who is actually in the country about what the situation is. And yeah, if anything else, I hope it maybe inspires people to take maybe a closer interest in the realities of the society that you live in. So thank you very much again for taking
Yeah,
time.
well, thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you for caring to hear from voices inside Iran. And I hope, as you said, more people are inspired um, to understand how the narrative is manipulated and how things on the realities on the ground can be very, very different from what they've been told.